Hello, I am Anabolsos, and today I wanted to talk about my uh, philosophical ideas regarding natural laws and natural rights, in the sense that, particularly, my refusal of them or refutation of them, to be more exact. So let me just be very clear here. My position is absolutely not that I am saying that natural laws and natural rights should not exist per se. That is not my exact position. And taking that position, the position that requires a presumption that such a thing could exist, is not my position. My position is simply that they do not exist, or more exactly, or in furthermore, that they cannot exist. And this is not a position that is derived purely on an ideological opposition of having such things in the function of government, but rather is derived from an intellectual position that I hold, where from an intellectual perspective, I cannot justify the existence of such things ontologically and epistemologically speaking. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, if you are to say that nature is to be a guide on righteousness or right and wrong or justice in general, what you then would have to prove is that nature in itself is right or just, in another sense. I'm using those as synonyms for the purpose of this video. Righteousness and justice, right and just. So now, to do that, to prove that nature is right, you would either have to give a sort of analysis of nature and therefore deconstruct nature, which means that you would have to say that uh, there is a further regress by which nature is justified, in which case I would say, what is that? And or you would have to come to a point where you view this as an axiomatic truth, which is to say that you simply say nature is good and that's that, which I would say is somewhat logically fallacious, as it is an is to ought problem there. And I find it very difficult to go to varying points and actually derive an ought from an is. And that's why my particular view of ethics and justice is not really based necessarily on ideas of metaphysical ought, but rather on interlocking relationships of ises, or matters of fact. In that sense, I say that if someone in authority is going to punish you for taking a particular action, then that person in authority is indeed exercising a sort of right over you and is establishing a form of justice. Because when it concerns interpersonal relationships, let's say you are alone, the only person in existence, then obviously the right and wrong of your situation, while you might say that there are particular natural elements that influence you, ultimately it is based on your choices, because you are the one that has the power over your body. And therefore, you are a judge of yourself. And therefore, there is indeed an authority relationship that is occurring here. Now, let's say there's two individuals, and let's say they both want to chop down and use a particular tree. So, what is going to happen? Well, they could have a unilateral arbitration where one person simply says, uh, I am going to decide which one of us should be cutting down the tree, and whoever it is that I decide will be the one that cuts down the tree. That's a unilateral arbitration. There could be a bilateral arbitration where both parties come together and decide to mutually authorize a particular compromise. Or there could be a third party arbitration where both parties agree to involve a third individual to arbitrate the situation and therefore place that individual in an authority over the dispute. And finally, assuming that there is no unilateral arbitration, no bilateral arbitration, and no third party arbitration, you have violence, wherein the individual takes authority by means of force of arms to physically overpower the opponent and therefore take the right. And of course, that would happen assuming that no form of arbitration occurs. And I believe that these forms of interactions are fundamentally true on varying levels of society and on international relations, in the sense that there is usually going to be someone who is going to take the authority, whether it is a unilateral authority, a multilateral authority, or perhaps there is a third party in the situation who is the authority, or the authority is going to be gained through violence. And I do not view this as simply something that is theoretical in the sense that it is necessarily unproved, but rather as something that I would confidently say is a law of interaction. Now, because if there is no compromise made, then obviously the individual with the greater power by force of violence is going to be the one who takes a day. Now, when it comes to a government generally will hold a monopoly of violence in the sense that a government prefers to be that power that has the ability to coerce by means of violence, if necessary, or to automatically be declared the third party in the arbitration, or to be the unilateral party in the arbitration, or the bilateral party in the arbitration, with the subject of a government always being beneath the government in that function. Now, this is not something to say that there is a bias towards authoritarianism. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that if a government does not establish its jurisdiction over its subjects, then the government falls apart and weakens and risks being destroyed. And a great example would be in a situation where large amounts of protection rackets occur. That is someone taking uh, this authority of violence and therefore muscling in on the turf of what would normally be a government function, which would be policing and taxation correspondingly to the actions of a protection racket. So, as I said, when it then concerns natural rights and natural law, I do not believe such things to have the same functional truths to them as as, let's say, my functional truths of the monopoly of violence and different poses of arbitration. Because, let's say, a government does indeed avow the ideas of natural law and natural rights, how is the government going to enforce them? The government is going to enforce them by means of arbitration and, if need be, violence. And that is simply how it is. That is a law of governance that is like the laws of thermodynamics. And of course, I will say that, let's say hypothetically, just hypothetically, that if there were an entity that was all powerful and therefore had a greater power than all other entities combined, and was omniscient and therefore knew everything that occurred and was willing to enforce its particular sense of justice upon the entire universe, then one might say, who will judge that entity if that entity is indeed more powerful? And would that entity's form of justice not be the absolute form of justice, regardless of what exists in nature? Because this entity, being all powerful, would be able to warp nature to its desires. So I will say that is, in essence, like the third law of thermodynamics. Because in the third law of thermodynamics, there's reference made to a perfect crystal. Now, anyone who has ever seen crystals will be likely to say that perfect crystals probably do not exist in this universe. So, does that mean that the third law of thermodynamics is invalid? No, it does not, because the third law of thermodynamics is something that, though being given an ideal state in example, is applicable to lesser degrees on the universe. And I see that similar to my law that that justice is derived from authority. That is something that is true in the sense that it is functionally true, and that you would be hard pressed to find a form of justice that exists without any authority to back it up. And that's why I say that if nature is indeed your justice, what justifies nature? And this is not necessarily an argument for the existence of God, because that's not the argument I'm making. Because if it were the argument I would be making, I would be essentially asking for you to disprove your idea that justice does not derive from authority in order to prove my idea that justice derives from authority by inserting a deity into the mix, which would prove my point, which is not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find, is there something else that justifies, that is underneath nature? Because why should we be concerned with the common good of humanity? What is the point of that? Who gets to say that that is something that we should be concerned about? You might say, well, it's natural for a species to be interested in its own perpetuation and to be interested in your own good, but let's be fair, people commit suicide all the time. People commit genocide. So I would say that if this is indeed a natural inclination, it is one that is easily subverted. So it certainly falls under the purview and the category of things that would need to be justified in some sense by logic or other means. So what I'm ultimately trying to say here is that my idea that justice derives from authority is indeed more accurate to the function of the observable universe than the idea that justice is derived from nature. So I do say that justice is indeed an artifice something that is created, something that is artificial rather than natural, and it is an artifice of the powerful. And I don't consider that to be a problem for my particular ideology. So for that reason, I do not need to abstract justice into something separate from the powerful in order to justify the overthrowing of the powerful, because I don't have a problem with people having power. That's not a problem that I have. That's not to say that I'm an authoritarian. That's certainly not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that it is by authority that justice is established. It is by authority that justice is enforced. And it is not by nature that justice is established. And it is not by nature that justice is enforced. And I think you'd be very hard pressed to, at least in a political sense, prove otherwise. So anyway, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there any particular argument that maybe I have not heard that might be useful for me to hear? If you disagree, please do tell me so in the comments section below. If you agree, please tell me in the comments section below. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you want more. Always ready for more video suggestions if people have any suggestions on a particular element of anything that you'd like me to address. And if you want to, you can donate on Patreon. So thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.